Hello everyone, I am Apeksha, Assistant Professor, Indraprasth Law College. Today we will be doing the topic India's foreign policy with special reference to its neighboring countries. Now the basic concept of foreign policy refers to the sum total of a principal interest and objectives which a country promotes while interacting with other countries. The thrust of foreign policy keeps on changing according to the changing international conditions. So basically, India's foreign policy have some distinctive character of its own. It is unique. After achieving independence in 1947, it chose to follow an independent foreign policy and to maintain its separate identity. In a world surcharged with Cold War alignments, non-alignment has become the conceptual framework of India's foreign policy. So India was the first nation to guide the third world countries on the path of non-alignment. India's foreign policy is rooted in two traditions. Now, what is the two traditions? The first one is that of a British India, which concerns for a territorial integrity and security of South Asia. The other part, tradition, is that of Indian National Congress, which got evolved from 1920s, almost wholly or under the direction of Nehru, focusing on the problems of world peace, anti-colonialism and anti-racism. The three problems: world peace, anti-colonialism and anti-racism. This is the basic concept of foreign policy. And it also keeps on changing with the changing dynamics of geopolitics. The Indian foreign policy have many phases. As it shows, the first phase, which was in 1947 to 62, optimistic non-alignment. Now, what does this period says and marked? We'll be doing it later in the video. Then the second phase, decade of realism and recovery, happened in 1962 to 1971. Then the third phase, the Greater Indian Regional Assertion, 1971, 1991. Then the fourth phase, safeguarding strategic autonomy. The fifth phase, 1998 to 2013. India, a balancing power. Then the sixth phase, 2013 until now, energetic engagement. Now if I start with the first phase, this period is marked with the setting of bipolar world. As written, a bipolar world with camps led by the United States and USSR. And India's objective in this phase were to resist dilution of its sovereignty and then rebuilding its economy and consolidating its integrity. That was the major India's objective in this phase. In the phase of optimistic non-alignment from 1947 to 1962. And so, the establishment of non-alignment movement in 1961. Basically, India was the first country to be decolonized, and thus it was natural for India to lead Asia and Africa in a quest for a more equitable world order. And so India played a critical role in the establishment of NAM. We call it NAM, Non-Alignment Movement. In short, we call it NAM. It got established in 1961 and which marked the peak of Third World solidarity. However, the 1962 conflict with China not only brought this period to an end, but in a manner that significantly damaged India's standing on NAM. which we'll be doing it later and is not that important, but what was important is what was in the first phase of the Indian foreign policy. Going on to the next second phase, which was from 1962 to 1971, the decade of realism and recovery. Now what happened after 1962 war? After 1962 war, as written, India made pragmatic choices on security and political changes. It looked beyond non-alignment in the interest of national security. However, India faced external pressures on Kashmir from USA and UK, which is the Tashkent Agreement, happened in 1965. And then India getting closer to the USSR. It was all coming under the second phase. So we call it a decade of realism and recovery. What happened is, through Tashkent Agreement, both India and Pakistan agreed to withdraw all armed forces to pre-war positions, to restore diplomatic relations, and to discuss economic, refugee, and many other such questions. But this agreement did not contain a no-power pact or any renunciation of Pakistan's aggression in Kashmir. Therefore, as written, that India gets closer to USSR, India now started tilting towards USSR. That was whole about the second phase. Moving on to the third phase, which was in 1971, 1991, which is the Greater Indian Regional Assertion. So India showed some remarkable use of hard work when it liberated Bangladesh in India-Pakistan war in 1971. However, it was particularly complex phase as the US-China-Pakistan axis. India also faced sanctions from USA, its allies, after conducting a peaceful nuclear explosion test in 1974, Pokhran 1. And then further, the collapse of USSR. The written third point, collapse of USSR, India's close ally. The economic crisis in 1991 compelled India to look again at the first principle of both domestic and foreign policy. Moving on to the fourth phase, which talks about safeguarding strategic autonomy. The emergence of unipolar world, which was led by the USA. It encouraged India to change its approach to world affairs. The effect of the emergence of unipolar world. This quest for strategic autonomy was particularly focused on securing its nuclear weapon option. This Pokhran 2 nuclear test, 1998. So this is a period where India reached out to engage the US, Israel and Asian countries more intensively. So the Look East policy, we'll be discussing it later in the video about the policy. Moving on to the fifth phase, which talks about, in this period, basically India gradually started acquired the attributes of balancing power. And it is reflected in India's US nuclear deal, 23 agreements. At the same time, India could also make common cause with China on climate change and trade, consolidate further ties with Russia, by helping to fashion BRICS into major global forum. So the 4 points important: India-US nuclear deal, Second is closer relationship with USA. The BRICS is formed as a major global forum. Then India gradually acquired the attributes of balancing power against the rise of China. The sixth phase, from 2013 till now, energetic engagement. Now in this phase of India's policy of non-alignment turned into multi-alignments. So India's policy, the very first point says that India's policy of non-alignment has turned into multi-alignment. Then India started playing the role of leader for the third world, because India was more aware about its own capabilities, its expectations that the world has of India. So India is among the major economies of the world is one factor, right? Then the relevance of India's talent in creating and sustaining global technology is also likely to grow. It is likely to grow in the coming time. India's willingness to shape key global negotiation, such as the conference in Paris on climate change, is also very important. So we could see how India's willingness to shape the third point, India's willingness to shape key global negotiations, especially in environment related matters. Then the fourth point, India has started asserting itself beyond the South Asia. How did it? Through its approach towards the Indian Ocean region, the Sagar Initiative, Extended Neighborhood, Act East policy, Think West policy. Such policies were initiated. Neighborhood First policy, which will be learning what it is. Sagar Initiative, as said. This was all which comes in the sixth phase of the foreign policy. After talking about this, I would like to draw your attention towards the factors which shape the Indian foreign policy, which is also equally important to know. The very first being geographic and strategic factors. Then there is historical and political traditions, domestic factors, economic factors, national interest, and so on. If I talk about geographic and strategic factor, so geography has conferred upon India one of the main determinants of foreign and defense policies, shaping its attitude towards the other countries. It has played a major part. Whereas if we see the historical and political tradition, as Nehru said, I like to quote, what did he say about it? A country's foreign policy ultimately emerges from its own traditions, objectives, and more particularly from its recent past. This is what Nehru said about the foreign policy. So the political tradition, particularly if I say the recent one of any country, is an important determinant. The political tradition basically of any country is an important determinant of its foreign policy. Any political tradition. Like India's foreign policy is the product of traditional values of its society and its commitments of national movement during freedom struggle. That's the importance, significance of political tradition. Then coming on to the next point of economic factor, again important part, what Nehru said. So basically Nehru used to say that ultimately foreign policy is the outcome of economic policy. We all know this, that India had a terrible poverty. India's terrible poverty made rapid economic development. It leaded to the economic development. started making it. Now, in spite of natural wealth, India cannot be classed as a leading economic power because of lack of industrial establishment. But comparative India's comparative backwardness has made foreign aid and external assistance dispensable. Coming on to this economic factor, economic compulsion, or could be said the peace was a minimum precondition for the economic development, especially for our country. Nehru said, I'll quote, what did he say? He said that we can't afford war and its devastation. We want to build up our strength in peace and under the shelter of neutrality. Hereby, making peace important condition for the economic development. Coming on to the national interest, another factor shaping foreign policy. Indian foreign policy, it needs to be oriented towards safeguarding its national interest, and then can be molded to influence and promote the concept of peace and friendship around itself and abroad. But it's the very basic nature, the national interest has to be seen. So the identification of national interest is crucial. The other factors being personality factor and the domestic context, international context, again an important part, the international conditions in which India's foreign policy and relations were formulated and implemented was characterized by the Cold War between the communist and the Western camp. So this period of proliferation of military pacts and alliances, it led to the establishment of NATO, which I've explained, Warsaw Pact, and the other superpowers, USA and USSR. International context has to be seen, as there was many part of the world which was going under colonial rule, under the political domination of Western nation. So requirement of shaping foreign policy plays. Hope you understand what was the factors which was the basic factors, the important factors shaping India's foreign policy. All right. Moving on to the next, the changing policies as written over here. Nehru's NAM, then Modi's hyphen. Moving on to a very important and as said previously, we'll be discussing about neighborhood first policy and Act East policy. Right. So, India shared its boundaries with nations including Afghanistan, Bhutan, Bangladesh, China, Maldives, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nepal and Sri Lanka. This neighborhood first policy, this policy basically is of the government. This policy of government aims to improve interaction with its immediate neighbors and Indian Ocean island states. What does it aim? To improve the interactions with its neighbors. Right? Now, it achieves various goals to achieve this goal, there are certain approaches like connectivity, resource support. They connect. How do they connect? They connect by signing MOUs, Memorandum of Understandings, right? Like SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. MOU, signing MOU with the members of SAARC for cooperation in areas of trade, infrastructure, commercial linkage. So agreements, these agreements basically what does they do? They ensure a free flow of resources, energy, goods, labor, information across borders. And then comes the resource support. Right. You're giving a financial aid, equipments, human resource training. Now, for example, India provided assistance to over 1,700 tons of relief material and medical assistance to Nepal after the 2016 earthquake. Remember. So this way, you shape you improve the interactions with your neighbor. This is what neighborhood first policy is about. And then the regional institutions are important for India to emerge as a regional leader in South Asia. Like India participated in SAARC for development in the region. Then is one more example is of Bangladesh, Bhutan, India and Nepal grouping for energy development, that is motor vehicles, water power management, intergrid connectivity and so on. This is what the whole neighborhood first policy is. Connectivity, resource support to weak nation, regional institution like SAARC, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, grouping. And so, moving on to the Act East policy. What exactly is the Act East policy? So, PM Narasimha Rao government launched the Look East policy in 1992. Due to changes in geopolitical and economic circumstances, the present government has renamed it as Act East to represent their proactive role in increased integration of India into the ASEAN, which is Association of Southeast Asian Nation and East Asian countries. In furtherance, moreover, the Prime Minister also attends the annual ASEAN summits, engages in high-level exchanges with the member nation. And India also recently got involvement in the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, which is a BIMSTEC. It is a representative of its commitment to this policy. Now, how to obtain its objective? Through connectivity, through culture and commerce. How through connectivity? Infrastructure investments like bridges and highway, improve access to gateway ports and the technology transfer. Then coming on to the cultural part, promotion of tourism in famous cultural and regional sites, promoting tourism over there, preservation of the ancient manuscripts, the heritage sites and the artifacts. And commerce, strong production network, regional value chains, bilateral trade agreements. So basically these three primary objectives of Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral, technical and economic cooperation. Connectivity, culture and commerce, the third point as written. So under this Act of East policy, the least developed nations are Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. They have a special focus area for India. So the future focus need for greater realism in policy, we needed strong economy, need more multi-alignments, and greater risk. Ending on to this, thank you.